Hello, this is Dr. Richard Olivas, and this is History 11. This lecture is titled The 7 Years' War, Crises with England and the American Revolution. The main idea we are trying to communicate and convey today is listed on your screen as the thesis statement. After the 7 Years' War removed the French threat from North America and provided colonists a sense of identity, Americans perceived parliamentary legislation to pay off war debts as a systematic attack on their fundamental liberties. This crisis led to war between the colonies and England. If someone knew nothing else about the start of the American Revolution, in the title, we see a good summary of that. The 7 Years' War led to a crisis with England, which in turn led to the American Revolution. First, the climactic 7 Years' War. You can see on this map that on the left-hand side, dating to about 1754, on the North American continent, there are three colors that we should look at in particular. The pink, which stands for the British American colonies, the yellow or the gold that show the French American colonies, and then the green that shows the Spanish American colonies. So before 1754, there are three European nations fighting to gain control or take control of North America: the British, the French, and the Spanish. On the right side of the screen, you can see the map after the 7 Years' War. Here, there are only two colors left: pink, which represents British colonies, and green, which represents Spanish colonies. And you can see that all the gold has disappeared. That means that the French have now pulled out of North America. So the three European powers that were trying to control North America before the war started reduced to two after the end of the war. The climactic 7 Years' War. War and the management of empire. Point A on your screen. Beginning in 1754, France and England fought the fourth, the largest, and the most significant war for empire that had begun in the late 17th century. Sometimes this war, called the 7 Years' War or the French and Indian War, sometimes it's called the Great War for Empire, whatever you call it. This global conflict represented a showdown for control of North America between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. In North America, the English-American or the Anglo-American forces prevailed over the French, and their victory dramatically affected the lives of North Americans of all races and nationalities. Now, point one here says that England strengthens its presence in the colonies after 1689. Now, before 1689, England did not exert a lot of control over its British North American colonies. Remember, Virginia started in 1609, only 80 years before this. Massachusetts, Puritan Massachusetts, started in 1630, less than 60 years before this. And England was preoccupied during these years between 1609 and 1689 to a significant degree. There was an English Civil War, and then there was the Glorious Revolution, in 1688. After the Glorious Revolution, beginning in 1689, England began to tighten up its imperial administration. That means its oversight of the empire, meaning the mother country in England and all her colonies. To do that, England did a number of things. You don't need to memorize that or anything, but England created a professional board of trade to oversee commerce between England and her colonies. It enlarged the customs service. Overseas, it established what are called vice admiralty courts, where English judges sat to immediately take up court cases having to do with issues at sea or admiralty issues. And it increased the powers and duties of royal governors in the colonies. During these years, as we said, sometimes called a period of salutary neglect, England did not exert a lot of control over its colonies, but it slowly began to, first in ways that were small and then in ways that were bigger. Point A2. England's 1744 war with France showed the need for fiscal discipline. Now, you don't need to know all the background. England and France seem to have a lot of wars, and I myself don't remember all of them. But in 1739, England declared war against Spain and then against France in 1744 because England wanted to dominate all the commercial traffic in the Atlantic basin, that is, on the Atlantic Ocean between Europe and the Americas. When that war was over, it became apparent to England that it really did not have the money to maintain its empire adequately. In particular, England did not have enough money to station troops and build army bases inside North America, particularly in newer areas where Americans wanted to move in the western regions and so on. So beginning in about 1744, England becomes very aware that the colonies are going to have to start paying much more money to share the costs of running the empire, particularly the cost of what we call colonial defense. That means England was determined somehow to come up with a plan to raise revenues to force colonists to pay a greater share of defending the empire, particularly keeping troops and army bases open on the North American continent. Now, the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War that began in 1754, took place because England and France were struggling to see who can control the interior. Now, remember, there are a lot of people in the American colonies. The population's quite large. By 1750, there were well over 1 million people. Now I know by today's standards, that's not a lot of people, but back then, over 1 million people was a lot. And inside New France, there were comparatively few people because New France was built on the fur trade. So there's a lot of tension between English colonists and French colonists, especially when the English colonists want to send settlers into the interior in search of farmland. Eastern merchants sent traders west to talk to Indians and to try to pay more money and outbid what the French were paying for furs. So as English colonists start to penetrate and push into the Ohio River Valley, as you can see on this map, they are beginning to challenge French dominance of the North American interior. In other words, if you look at this map, it shows the Ohio River from Fort Pitt, which would be modern day Pittsburgh. And then you can see that the Ohio River sort of goes up and then winds around and goes all the way over to the Mississippi River. So whoever controls this river controls the American interior. And before 1754, the French and their Indian allies controlled it. The English did not, but the English wanted to push into this valley and find farmland to settle. So when the English push into the interior, that makes it much more likely there will be a war. The French resisted by building forts to block English expansion and by inciting American Indians against the English. By 1755 or so, the French had driven the English out of the Ohio River Valley and had forts established all the way here to Pittsburgh. And here you can see the Ohio River where it starts. And then you can see the Allegheny and the Monongahela rivers joining to form the Ohio. So the Ohio River leads directly to the Mississippi River. So whoever controls the Ohio River going to the left or going west controls the interior of North America. The French controlled it, but the English wanted it. And so in England, merchants there, supported by American clients, urged the King of England to take military action against the French. And so the English government dispatched or sent troops to America in 1754, and then the French sent troops, and then the 7 Years' War was on, just like that, in 1754. Representatives of 7 American colonies met with Iroquois Indian leaders at Albany, New York in 1754 to try to create an alliance, an English-Iroquois alliance, and also to create and perfect a plan of colonial union. The Iroquois made a decision not to ally with the English or the British, the English-American forces. And then the plan for colonial union was rejected at the so-called Albany Congress. And for the first few years of the war, it looked like the French forces were going to win. And it didn't look good for the English. But in 1757, the turning point came because William Pitt became the new Prime Minister of England, and William Pitt decided to commit money and troops in much greater amounts to the American campaign. And so William Pitt threw all of England's military might, muscle, and money into the American theater of war. And the tide began to turn right away. In the Northeast, as point C1 on your screen indicates, the Iroquois decided to ally with the English in 1759. This was largely because the Indians could see that the English were going to eventually win and that the French were going to almost surely lose. So the Iroquois made a calculated diplomatic decision to side with the English against the French. And then, as we will see, English forces destroyed Quebec and other important French cities, making it pretty clear who was going to win. In the southeast, where the other entrance to the Ohio River Valley is near the Cumberland Gap, the Cherokee pledged their support to the English side, but they did not pledge until 1761. But in effect, French power in North America was effectively broken by 1760 after the Battle of Montreal. Now, fighting continued in the Caribbean and in Europe for a few more years, so a peace treaty wasn't signed until 1763. This is a map that shows Quebec, Canada today. Well, it doesn't show it today. It shows it back in about 1768. But you can see Quebec there in the background with ships in the harbor, one of the world's most beautiful cities. This is a painting titled The Destruction of Quebec, 1759. And this is was a terribly destructive battle. And you can see the people just looking in amazement at the damage that was done. So in 1763, the Treaty of Paris was signed, and it ended the 7 Years' War, sometimes called the French and Indian War, and the boundary lines were redrawn. And as this map again shows us, you can see that French power is absent now after 1763. The French withdraw. And now the control of North American continent, at least as far as the Europeans are concerned, is down from 3 to 2. And the last two contenders are English, the English government and the English colonies in the pink, and the Spanish colonies in the green. The consequences of war. Now, of course, the consequences of this war were many, and we can only name a few of them, but one consequence is that after this point, American Indians, instead of having 3 sources of trade goods, now only have 1, because not only were the French gone, but the Spanish left Florida. And so that the Indians who before could maintain their independence in commercial relations and in trade by sort of trading with 3 partners, now are down to 1 partner. So that hurt American Indians a lot. It also hurt slaves in the lower South, because slaves in South Carolina and Georgia could run away and find sanctuary or refuge inside Spanish-controlled Florida. But when Florida was when the French evacuated Florida, then slaves could no longer run there because it was now controlled by the British. So you can see on this map, in 1763, England took control of Florida in exchange for Spanish control of Cuba. It was sort of a switch like that. Once Florida was in British hands, slaves could no longer run away from Georgia and find a Spanish refuge. The end of the 7 Years' War then hurt Africans in America a great deal. Another important consequence of the end of the 7 Years' War is that England attempted to separate colonists and Indians. Now, if this is a little difficult to understand, please be assured it was even more difficult for people back then to understand. At the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, the British government, even though it controlled all the land from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River, it drew a line called the Proclamation Line of 1763 across the top of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, that line separated the 13 colonies and the interior lands, as you can see here, lands reserved for the Indians. Colonists were not allowed at this point to cross the line and settle in the interior until the government revenues were sufficient to protect and govern those Americans going into the interior. So in other words, the war had been fought ostensibly for the purpose of English colonists being able to move into the interior, but the war is over and their own government stops them from going in until enough money is available to open up the interior in an orderly fashion. That means putting in army bases, putting in roads, putting in bridges, making internal infrastructure improvements, and things like that. And this is very confusing and even upsetting to Americans who thought that the war had been about their right or their claim to be able to go into the interior. And now suddenly they're not allowed to go in. Another reason that Americans could not go into the interior is because no matter what they claimed was theirs, Indians actually controlled conditions on the ground. Indians like this man, Pontiac. And Indians were determined to not let the English move into the interior. And the English military bases, you can see on this map, you can see these fires at the different forts. Those are British forts that are attacked by Indians and overrun by Indians. So there aren't even enough, so even the army troops can't control their own home turf, their own military bases. So if the army can't exist there safely, there's no way American settlers could go there safely. So the English government was not able to guarantee the safety of Americans moving into the interior. Now, I should let me back up just briefly to this prior point, just to make sure that the last 2 points, make sure I cover them. The 7 Years' War left the colonies in debt-ridden and very weakened circumstances, but Americans looked to the future and thought that the future would be much better than the past. So Americans were devastated by the war. Many widows now had lost their husbands. Many, they were orphans. There was a lot of poverty among families, particularly women and children from husbands who had died. So despite those great difficulties, there was optimism looking forward. The 7 Years' War also, as point 5 here indicates, also paved the way for colonial independence, because the legislative bodies or the lawmaking assemblies in the colonies demanded more power, because they were asked by England to raise taxes, and they agreed to raise taxes in exchange for having greater power and greater independence. Also during this war, an entire generation of political and military leaders were trained. So they sort of got their footing in this conflict. And of course, by removing the French and the Spanish threat from the eastern half of North America, colonists were very optimistic looking forward that they could expand. In fact, the end of this war freed Americans to a great extent from dependence on England, certainly for defense. And many Americans began to reassess and reevaluate the benefits of being in the British Empire. Some would have said that to continue in the British Empire was not worth it. Point 2, the crises with England. The crisis with England. At the end of England, George Grenville became the main finance minister, the chief minister in England. And George Grenville proposed a series of revenue taxes, taxes that would raise revenues or funds that would allow England to safely guard, build up, and protect the interior for Americans who wanted to go in there. Grenville's revenue program, which consisted of a number of different measures and taxes, was designed to force the American colonists to pay a greater share of running the empire, and in particular, to pay a greater share of the costs of colonial defense, putting troops, keeping troops, army bases, and so on, in such great numbers that they could not be driven out by Indian fighters. That revenue program, Grenville's taxes, began or initiated a rift, as one scholar said, between England and her colonies that led to the Revolutionary War, or the War for Independence. That is, Grenville's revenue program permanently breached the relationship between England and the colonies, and it could never be repaired. This is a painting of George Grenville, Treasurer and Finance Minister of England, who was the architect not only of the Stamp Act, but the Currency Act, the Sugar Act, and other laws designed to raise revenues to provide money to open up the interior. Those measures by Grenville created greater economic hardship than already existed at the time. Now, you wouldn't need to memorize these points, this particular point exactly, but just to let you know, the Sugar Act, for example, it promised very strict enforcement of the tax on imported molasses. And it added a number of products to what were called the enumerated lists. That is lists that England was a list of products that England very carefully wanted to monitor in order to tax. It strengthened those courts that we talked about, those vice admiralty courts. So raising taxes for revenues created even greater hardships than already existed. Now, the other thing is that these revenue measures were passed by the English Parliament, particularly the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. Some of the measures came from the Board of Trade, but the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act came through Parliament. And people in the American colonies particularly had an idea that the Parliament, and in particular the House of Commons, was a check or a restraint on kingly or monarchical power. But when the Parliament passed these laws, Americans in the colonies began to think that the entire Parliament was corrupted. And so they began to see Parliament as a threat. And so they began in the colonies to try to define and spell out and to limit the limits of parliamentary power. That is, the colonies tried to talk about and then spell out exactly how much power they thought Parliament had to make them do certain things, like pay taxes to open up the interior. And American colonists began to view the Parliament as a threat to their English liberties and English freedoms. This is a page of 1-penny stamps issued under the authority of the British Stamp Act. These stamps were it would be like putting a postage stamp on a letter today in the United States. If you buy a postage stamp, that's sort of like a tax or a fee that raises money. In this case, to buy these stamps was a way to raise revenues or income for the government to pay for the cost of opening land west of the Appalachian Mountains, to pay for roads, bridges, army bases, and troops. So that's what these stamps were supposed to do. Here is a photograph of an actual set of playing cards with a stamp tax label. The Stamp Act placed taxes on paper goods like newspapers, legal documents, and even newspapers and even playing cards to raise revenues to open up the interior of North America west of the Appalachian Mountains. The wrapping, the outer wrapping here threatens would-be lawbreakers with, quote, a 10-pound penalty for selling any playing cards unlabeled, and a 20-pound penalty for selling or buying any label or wrapper used before. The Stamp Act put heavy taxes on a number of items. Now you can see that in this advertisement, here is a copy of an almanac. An almanac is a book that talks about weather conditions, the average amount of rainfall. Farmers and sailors used almanacs because they included in many almanacs were tide tables and that had, the high water mark, the low water mark, and that sort of thing in many different areas. This one was for Boston. And you can see at the very bottom, I made it bigger here, it says, price before the Stamp Act takes place, $50 per dozen, and 6 coppers single. After the act takes place, more than double that price. So many Americans resented the fact that the Stamp Act doubled the price of everyday items to open up the interior. It's not that Americans only objected to high prices or high taxes. They objected in principle to any tax of any amount that would force them to pay to open up the interior. They thought they had a right to go into the interior and sort of fend for themselves. But they didn't want to wait for the more orderly settlement that would involve roads, bridges, army bases, and large numbers of troops. So to the surprise of many people, the Stamp Act set off these powerful riots from the northern part of the colonies to the very south, from the coastal plain into toward the foothill area, toward the foothill of the Appalachian Mountains. There were powerful riots that destroyed a lot of government property, and people were shocked by the extent of the damage. This is a Stamp Act riot in Boston, titled "The Folly of England and the Ruin of America." And you can see here the people that are carrying torches, hanging people in effigy, and who are otherwise intent on destroying government property. They didn't kill people, but they destroyed a lot of government homes and government-owned property throughout the 13 colonies. As a result of the Stamp Act and the riots, delegates from colonies, from 9 specific colonies, sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress that met in October 1765. This is the building in Lower Manhattan, not far from the New York Stock Exchange today. This exact building is no longer standing, but a replacement building is there, but the old City Hall. But this is where the Stamp Act Congress met, and the delegates to that Congress debated. They talked about what rights England had or did not have, in their opinion, to tax them. And the Stamp Act Congress denied in a formal statement that England had the right to tax the colonies directly for revenue. Demonstrations across the 13 colonies eventually caused England to repeal and do away with the Stamp Act, which took place in March of 1766. This is a cartoon titled or called The Repeal or the Funeral of a Miss America Stamp, or Burying the Stamp Act. This cartoon, from an American point of view, exposes the errors of the Stamp Act. English Stamp Act supporters, including George Grenville, and I have a red arrow there that shows Grenville, who's fourth in the procession. They gather at a dock to carry a small coffin containing the remains of the bill of the Stamp Act toward an open vault. And then to the right, you can see all those stamps that are unused and unshipped that, of course, will never be distributed. So it was done away with. One result of the Stamp Act riots is that the rioters became very politicized. They mobilized political consciousness, they became very politically active, and they were emboldened by the fact that their protests had caused England to back down and repeal the Stamp Act. Now there was a brief, point 3, an uncertain interlude. An uncertain interlude. An interlude is sort of like an intermission. If you go to a play, there's the first part of the play, an intermission, then the second part. This is sort of a quiet period. Now, a new king, George III, came to the throne. And when he did, he chose assistants or ministers who did not have a lot of respect in the parliament. And his policies were sometimes incoherent, they were confusing, they wavered back and forth. And he and his ministers did not generate a lot of confidence. But King George III, the new king, and his finance minister, Lord Townshend, were determined to pass new revenue measures and make them stick and never back down. So he was going to show himself to be a very strong king. And in 1767, Lord Townshend and the royal agencies took a number of steps to exercise greater control over the colonies. And it passed something called the Townshend duties, or the Townshend, a duty is a tax, the Townshend taxes to raise revenues to open up the interior. The king also prohibited the New York Assembly from meeting, because the New York Assembly said that it would not obey a 1765 law called the Quartering Act. The Quartering Act would have required that American colonies pay for the cost of royal troops in their colonial boundaries. And New York said, we're not going to pay those. And so England said, well, then your assembly is not going to meet, and you can't make laws for the colony of New York. So everything's sort of a standoff, sort of like that game where someone puts their hand up and you go like that, and you go like that, and you go like that. It just keeps ratcheting up, but there's never any solution. In this particular case, in response to the Townshend duties, or the revenue measures put forth by Lord Townshend, American colonists took a different approach. This time, they tried to start boycotts of English imported products. That is, they decided a boycott is when people agree not to buy certain items. And the American colonists said that they're not going to buy certain items to put pressure on English merchants who would begin to lose money to go to the king and say, can't we work out some kind of a deal? And can't we lift the Townshend duties? We're losing too much money. This is King George III of England, who very much wanted to be a strong king. This is Charles Townshend, Lord Townshend, the architect and enforcer of the Townshend duties for raising revenues to open up the North American interior. This is a painting of him in 1765. Townshend was determined to do what Grenville could not do or would not do. He was going to do it. So the boycotts began. American colonists used an economic boycott to end the Townshend duties or taxes. This is called a non-importation agreement or non-importation pact. These were a very important part of the efforts of the boycott. So you can see here, it says, we the subscriber, in the red, it says, we the subscribers, being sensible that it is absolutely necessary in order to extricate us out of these embarrassed and distressed circumstances to promote industry, economy, and manufactures among ourselves. And by this means, prevent the unnecessary importation of European commodities, the excessive use of which threatens the country with poverty and ruin. We therefore do promise and engage to and with each other that we will encourage the use and consumption of all articles manufactured in any of the British American colonies, and more especially in this province of Massachusetts, and that we will not, from and after the 31st of December of 1767, purchase any of the following articles imported from abroad. So there's a list of, I don't know, 30 or 40 items they're not going to import and pay for anymore. They're not going to buy them anymore. Loaf sugar, cordage or rope, anchors, coaches, chases, and carriages of all sorts, horse furniture, men and women's hats, men and women's apparel ready-made, household furniture, gloves, men and women's shoes, sole leather, so on. So if Americans can agree to stop buying these things, and if American stores will stop selling them, then English merchants will lose so much money that they will convince the king to repeal the Townshend duties, just like they repealed the Stamp Act. Mob violence resulting from the protests against the Townshend duties led England to take military control of Boston. This scene from 1768 shows British troops disembarking from ships or getting off their ships at the city's Long Wharf. You look carefully, you can see that wharf going all the way out there, and then the ships stopping there, and then soldiers in red, the red coats, getting off and marching into the city, because Boston was very much at the forefront of resistance. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty, as they called themselves, took out newspaper advertisements and posted flyers around the city and around the surrounding areas to boycott merchants like William Jackson, who refused to sign a non-importation agreement. So this ad was taken out in the paper. William Jackson, so they're sort of shaming this man publicly. William Jackson, an importer at the Brazen Head, north side of the townhouse, and opposite the town pump in Cornhill, Boston. It is desired that the Sons and Daughters of Liberty would not buy any one thing of him, of William Jackson. For in so doing, they will bring disgrace upon themselves and their posterity forever and ever. Amen. Sort of praying this guy into bankruptcy. And they were doing everything they could to force merchants to stop selling these imported items. By 1770, England's attempt to discipline the colonies were in shambles. And the Townshend duties, except the one on tea, were repealed. The same evening that the Townshend duties were repealed, the Boston Massacre occurred. On that night, British troops fired their guns on an unruly crowd of heckling citizens. 3 protesters, including black sailor Crispus Attucks, died on the spot, and 2 more died later of injuries that were suffered in that attack. Crispus Attucks, the first person to die for American freedom, and an African American, does not appear in this engraving. The later versions of the Boston Massacre, like this one, corrected earlier accounts that excluded Crispus Attucks and properly put him back in the center of the action, or closer to the center. This is an advertisement in the Boston Gazette only days after the Boston Massacre. You can see in red those 4 coffins, and the one on the right I've circled CA, standing for Crispus Attucks. And you can see his name underlined above that. This is a tremendous painting for a number of reasons. Crispus Attucks falling after being shot by British troops in the Boston Massacre. This mural from 1943 is one of the first to show the centrality of Crispus Attucks to the Boston Massacre. The first blood shed in the American Revolution was from an African American. And this painting helps give Crispus Attucks the historical attention and importance he deserves. It correctly puts him in the center of the action. And you can see that he's front and center with the bayonets and the guns pointed directly at him. The growing rift, or the growing split. Parliament, the English Parliament announced in 1772, let me just go back for a second, please. The Colonial Acts of Defiance, and then we'll talk about the Committees of Correspondence, both of those. First, Colonial Acts of Defiance. On June the 9th, 1772, Rhode Island colonists, calling themselves the Sons of Liberty, attacked and burned to the water the Gaspee, a British warship that had run aground. An act of defiance that infuriated England. So you can see the Sons of Liberty going out, some of them dressed as Indians, going out and then burning that to the water, this government warship. A lot of defiant acts like that taking place. Parliament announced in 1772 that it would begin to pay royal officials in Massachusetts. That means employees of the British government who were living in Massachusetts. It would begin to pay them with revenues from the towns and duties. When the Parliament said that, American colonists in Massachusetts were infuriated. They wanted to pay royal officials, and they did not want to use taxes that they disagreed with to pay government officials. So in response to the British proposal to use towns and duty revenues to pay these royal officials, Samuel Adams, who is pictured here, formed Boston's Committee of Correspondence on November the 2nd, 1772. The official purpose of the Committee of Correspondence, the purposes were to prepare a statement of rights of the colonists and of this province in particular, that means Massachusetts, to prepare a declaration of the infringement of these rights, and 3, to prepare a letter to be sent to all the towns of this province and to the world, giving the sense of this town. So this is forcing Americans to, at least in Massachusetts, to put into words their rights as they understand them and how those rights are being infringed, and to spread the word to other towns. This document shows the meeting, the town meeting of Boston, where the Committee of Correspondence was created. You can see here that a Committee of Correspondence was appointed to state the rights of the colonists. And to communicate those rights to towns in Massachusetts and to the world. Today it would be like putting it on the internet and letting people everywhere read what happened and hoping that it goes viral. The passage of the Tea Act in 1773 led to independence. The Tea Act allowed the nearly bankrupt East India Company to ship tea from the Indian subcontinent directly to America and bypass all the middlemen, the tea agents, the tea stores, and so on. So the Tea Act gave a complete monopoly to the East India Company. Merchants in the colonies claimed that Parliament was trying to gain acceptance of its power to tax by passing the Tea Act. The Tea Act, now first of all, you have to understand, people in England like tea. They drink a lot of tea. It's sort of a national drink. It's a very social custom to drink tea. The Tea Act of 1773 would have lowered substantially the price of tea to make it much more affordable, because it allowed the East India Company to bypass all the middlemen. And so the price, the English government thought that the price would drop a lot and they could just slip in a little tax on top of that. And they thought Americans would buy the tea and pay the tax. And then they could say, well, see, you don't mind paying taxes if the prices are low. So many colonists were alarmed about this because they said it would gain acceptance for taxation power. So a lot of colonists, especially in Massachusetts, had mass meetings. They forced the resignation of tea officials. And then they vowed or promised to prevent any tea from being imported and offloaded into the city of Boston. So some ships came in, they were down at the harbor, and the word got around that there was tea in there. And so the Sons of Liberty formed these mobs to go down to the harbor and prevent the tea from being offloaded. So the governor of Massachusetts, Thomas Hutchinson, told these protesters, I will give you so many hours to leave, and then I'm going to send in army troops, and they will forcibly offload the tea. So there was a big meeting in this building right here. The building still stands, by the way, called the Old South Meeting House. And on December the 16th, 1773, Bostonians who refused to allow tea that had been taxed by the English government to be unloaded from the ships in the harbor filled the inside of this meeting house. In fact, by some estimates, there were many hundreds, perhaps thousands more outside that could not get in. There were speeches. Sam Adams got up and spoke. A lot of people thought there's nothing that they could do. And then from the balcony of this very building, somebody cried out these famous words, "A teapot in Boston Harbor tonight." So the building emptied, walked down to the wharf, which at that time was not that far away. It's been filled in now. It's solid land now, but you can see, if you go to Boston, you can see where the outlines are. And they went down and had a huge protest. Some people call it the Boston Tea Party, but actually it was called a teapot in Boston Harbor because these Americans, these sons of liberty and daughters of liberty, dressed as Indians, boarded the ships and then pretended like the harbor was a huge teapot. And then they took the chest full of tea and smashed them open and dumped the tea and pretended like it was a big teapot. So now some have asked, why were they dressed like Indians? Well, part of that was because they were trying to hide their identity. But since Indians perhaps best represented what was authentically American, tea tax protesters dressed like Indians partly to create a new or newer self-image that was less English and more authentically American. And as I said, by dumping tea into Boston Harbor, protesters also imagined that they were creating a teapot in Boston Harbor. John Adams, who later became president of the United States, wrote this in his diary the day after the teapot in Boston Harbor. He said, "Last night, 3 cargoes of Bohea tea were emptied into the sea. This morning, a man of war sails. This is the most magnificent movement of all. There's a dignity, a majesty, a sublimity in this last effort of the patriots that I greatly admire. The people should never rise without doing something to be remembered, something notable and striking. This destruction of the tea is so bold, so daring, so firm, intrepid, and inflexible, and it must have so important consequences and so lasting that I can't but consider it as an epoch or a turning point in history." In response to the teapot in Boston Harbor, Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which closed the port of Boston, amended the Charter of Massachusetts, removed court cases that involved civil disturbances and prevented them from being tried in Boston, and sent the accused to England to face trial there before less sympathetic juries. And it sent a military governor to Massachusetts. Americans call these not the Coercive Acts, but the Intolerable Acts. This is it says, in response to the teapot in Boston Harbor, England's Parliament passed the Coercive Acts, which were designed to severely punish Massachusetts and to warn other colonies who might consider following suit. Colonists compared themselves to a humiliated, sexually abused woman. As liberty turns her face away from these outrageous actions. In response to the Intolerable Acts, the town meeting of Boston sent out a circular letter to committees of correspondence around the country, asking that a Continental Congress be assembled in Philadelphia. Every colony except Georgia sent delegates to the Continental Congress, sometimes called the First Continental Congress, which met in September 1774 in Philadelphia at Carpenter's Hall. You can see here John Adams, who wrote the diary entry, Gouverneur Morris, Alexander Hamilton, and Thomas Jefferson. The Congress, wrote historian Gary Nash, succeeded in converting Boston's cause into a national movement. Delegates to the First Continental Congress unanimously passed the Declaration and Resolves, which explained colonial grievances and justified colonial defiance of English policies and laws by appealing to natural law, the English Constitution, and the colonial charters. In part, the delegates said this, quote, "The good people of the several colonies, justly alarmed at these arbitrary proceedings of Parliament and administration, have severally elected, constituted, and appointed deputies to meet and sit in General Congress in the city of Philadelphia in order to obtain such establishment as that their religion, laws, and liberties may not be subverted. Congress agreed to reconvene in May of 1775. But even before the Second Continental Congress met, extra-legal revolutionary committees had already seized control of the government in most colonies, organized and armed militia units, enforced the boycott, and in other ways defied English authority. The war actually began in April 1775, 1 month before the Second Continental Congress met. General Thomas Gage, the military governor of Massachusetts, sent troops to seize colonial arms and ammunition in Concord, a small town outside of Boston, up the Charles River. Americans, warned of the plan, called out the Minutemen, civilian soldiers that said they could be ready in a minute. And their gunfights ensued, and the first British soldiers were killed. You can see your British troops here in the red entering Concord. You can see here American Minutemen attack force, American Minutemen attacks force British retreat from Concord. So you can see on this road that the Minutemen are on the hills and in the houses and looking out of windows. And the British troops are retreating, but they're being shot at and killed as they pass. So the British troops withdrew and went back to Boston. The Americans followed them there, and then there was a standoff for almost a year. You can see here, American and British armies entered into a prolonged stalemate after the fighting broke out at Concord and Lexington. It's a little hard to see, but in the center you can see Boston, and then in the upper left, the American forces and their camp, and then on the bottom, the English forces and their camp. In May 1775, when the Second Continental Congress met, the outbreak of fighting the month before at Concord and Lexington changed everything. The fighting made those debates very different. Now, another 14 months passed before the Americans, through the Congress, or represented by the Congress, issued a formal Declaration of Independence. But the war had already begun. Congress authorized formation of a Continental Army, appointed George Washington Commander-in-Chief, issued a declaration of causes, or a declaration of the causes of taking up arms, and then sent the King of England a peace proposal. But more importantly, the Continental Congress began to assume or exercise legislative and executive power. It became a government in waiting, if you will. There were as Congress continued to debate the question of independence, there were other military actions at Bunker Hill. Many members of Congress hoped to reconcile and find some way out of the impasse. But by the end of 1775, news arrived. The king had rejected the peace proposal, that he had sent additional troops to America, and he proclaimed that the colonies were in open and avowed rebellion, which meant that everything the Continental Congress was doing was treasonable and subject to arrest and the death penalty. This is a declaration of the Second Continental Congress. I've taken the bottom and circled it and put it up on the right to make it bigger. setting forth the causes and necessity of their taking up arms. So the Congress is explaining why they're using guns and while using weapons to protect themselves against England. This is the proclamation by the King of England. I circled the part on the right, which expresses his belief that the colonies are in rebellion. And notice I took that part and put it over on the right. It says that the colonies are in open and avowed or sworn rebellion, meaning that they won't stop. So it's beginning to look as if there's no turning back. And still, the Americans didn't break with England. They still didn't separate. But in January of 1776, this pamphlet appeared called Common Sense, authored by Thomas Paine, an Englishman who had been in the colonies for not that long a time, urging the Americans to make a final break with England. It was one of the most widely read pamphlets of early American history. Finally, in June 1776, Congress ordered a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder in a slaveholding country, drew heavily on current political theory that was familiar to most colonists. Congress voted to approve the Declaration of Independence in this room inside Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Then the document was signed on the 4th of July, 1776. It would be difficult in a course this short to fully analyze the importance of the Declaration of Independence. But these words, written largely by Jefferson, have meaning well beyond Jefferson and are fundamental to American freedom and Black American freedom. We hold these truths, the Declaration states, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, and so on. Those words, that all men are created equal, it didn't say women, it didn't say Black men or Native American men, but those words were out there. And once the horse is out of the barn, as they used to say, it's almost impossible to put it back in. And so the words take on a life of their own over time. And Jefferson is saying that these rights cannot be taken away from people. They're unalienable. And they are unalienable, in his opinion, because they are given to people by God. And among those rights, not exclusively limited to these, but among them are life, liberty or freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, so the United States begins the 13 colonies on the 4th of July, when the Declaration of Independence is issued. The 13 colonies become 13 states. And we are no longer a society that believes in a king. There's no more monarchy. So the United States calls itself a republic, which means a public thing. Res publius in Latin, or the people are king. So the question is, what does it mean to be a republic that starts as a result of a revolution? And we ask the question, what is an ideology? What are the ideas that were contained in the American Revolution. An ideology is a set of ideas that together make up a body of thought or a way of thinking. You could illustrate it by a cluster of stars that together make up a galaxy or something like that. Gradually, colonists pieced together a political set of ideas or ideology borrowed from different sources: English political thought, theories of the Enlightenment, and even from their own experience. Some have called this revolutionary republicanism. But the truth is, the interests and the experiences of American colonists was very different. So there was never a single coherent set of ideas that everyone believed. Some people believed part of it, some believed all of it, some believed some of this, some of that. Some thought it was a plot against liberty. Others thought that the Republic was a chance to revitalize our country's society, and so on. Or to put it another way, early America definitely meant something, but it meant several different things, not just one thing. Now, if you have a society born in a revolution or born out of a revolution, one question is, in all the upheaval, how far does the revolution go? Do you keep having a revolution? When does it stop? And Americans tended to agree, at least not all Americans, many Americans tended to agree that they didn't want to be a king. They didn't want to be under a king anymore. That they did not want to be part of the British Empire. That they did not want to be part of a monarchical system. They wanted to be a government of the people. That's a very big difference. But the question is, what kind of republic would it be? Because there are many different kinds of republics. There have been the republics. There was the Roman Republic. There was the ancient Greek Republic. There are Christian republics. There are Islamic republics. There are socialist republics. So the United States clearly was a republic. The people were sovereign. That's why the Constitution starts with the words, "We the people." The people are sovereign, not a king. But the question is, which people? White men, white women, black men and women, Native American men and women. This is an interesting exchange between Abigail Adams on the left and her husband, John Adams, on the right. Now in early 1776, shortly after Thomas Paine published Common Sense, but still before the Declaration of Independence was issued, Abigail Adams sent a letter. She said to her husband, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion, and we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So you can see that Abigail Adams has taken what we call the language of liberty, and she has reshaped it for the cause of women. And she's challenging her own husband to adopt the new code of laws, which is more generous and favorable to women than the other code of laws. That's a Very important challenge. What's surprising but not shocking is his response, which he probably never thought would be made public. And that's toward the bottom. Several weeks later, he said, "As to your extraordinary code of laws, I cannot but laugh." In other words, he said, "You're kidding, right? Are you joking? We have been told that our struggle has loosened the bands of government everywhere. Depend upon it," he told his wife. "We know better than to repeal our masculine systems." And then he becomes very condescending. "Although they are in full force, you know they are little more than theory. We dare not exert our power in its full latitude. We are obliged to go fair and softly, and in practice, you know we are the subjects, not the masters." Well, this is not true. Women were second-class citizens. They could not vote. They could not, in most cases, hold political office, and they could not, in many cases, own property independently of their husbands. So this was clearly not a republic of women. The 7 Years' War, crisis with England, and the American Revolution. To summarize, after the 7 Years' War removed the French threat from North America and provided colonists a sense of identity, Americans perceived parliamentary laws or legislation to pay off war debts as a systematic attack on their fundamental liberties as English people. This crisis led to war between the colonies and England. And the Americans, of course, will win that war, and they will create a republic. But the question of who are the people is something that was heavily debated then and still continues to be debated now. I appreciate your attention. I hope this lecture was interesting and informative. If you have questions, please feel free to email me, and I will do everything I can to try to make it clear for you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.